one semester of 8th grade Spanish is not really pulling through at the moment. Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross. Very excited today. I have Phil Gunson with me, who's the Venezuela analyst based in Caracas for the Crisis Group organization. Phil, very happy to have you to discuss all things going on in Venezuela.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's my pleasure.
Yeah. So I will say we are recording this at 9 o'clock in the morning. So don't get me wrong, not opposed to a beer this early. However, we have both chosen to take the responsible route. So I am drinking
There's no beer
nice
in here.
coffee.
I promise it's not beer.
Listen, even if there was, that's okay. But Phil's got tea because he's British. And so just two peas in a pod. Anyways, Phil, thank you so much for being here. Would love to know a little bit more about your background. And the question I always like to ask my guests is, why should we trust what you have to say?
Well, if we're talking about Venezuela, I suppose nobody's 100% trustworthy, are they? But I've lived here for 25 years. I came here as a journalist in 1999. I was a freelance reporter for foreign media for many years, The Economist, the BBC, and they seem to trust what I say. So I guess I'm trustworthy. I mean, if you catch me out, of course, then please tell me. But on the whole, I think at least I try to be trustworthy.
That's wonderful. And so you are in Caracas, which I did just ask before we were recording, if you were concerned about your safety, and would love for you to give the answer, which you gave me.
Yeah, well, everybody has to be concerned about their safety in Venezuela right now. I mean, we have, as we speak, there are 5 foreign nationals who appear on the face of it until we receive further evidence to be completely innocent, who've been picked up by the government accused of trying to assassinate the president. It can happen to anybody. You can be walking down the street, the police can stop you, check your phone, see if you have anything that they deem to be subversive on it, and haul you off to jail. This is a country with no rule of law. It's a country where the institutions, the justice system, the police, the courts, the prosecution service, all the institutions of state are in the hands of the government. So it's entirely arbitrary, and it's a lottery. So even if you try to be careful, there's no guarantee that you won't, feel the, I was going to say the long hand of the law, but in this case, since there's no law, I suppose it's the long hand of injustice.
Yeah. So I think that's a great segue into discussing what's been going on since Maduro, and I'm using air quotes here, won re-election. What's been the state of things?
Yeah, well, first of all, the Venezuelan electoral system is really pretty good. I mean, not the electoral rules that the government imposes, but the actual electronic voting system is really quite good and has lots of mechanisms that ensure that it's pretty much impossible to cheat, at least in terms of the final count. The votes are counted correctly here. The problem is that on the 28th of July, the government counted the votes, realized that it had lost, and presented a result which is at odds with all the evidence that we have. And we can go into the kind of evidence, if you like, later on. But the fact is the government lost, decided not to accept defeat. And that produced, as you might imagine, a lot of demonstrations. There were, in the first month, there were about 1,000 demonstrations, but particularly in the first couple of days. And that brought a very, very strong, very repressive reaction from the government. So they jailed around 2,000 people, a couple of dozen people were killed demonstrating. And of course, the opposition has presented its own evidence that it won. It's been backed up by a large number of countries around the world, including the US, the European Union, a lot of the neighbors in Latin America. The government, on the other hand, says that it's all a plot. It's a fascist terrorist plot to oust Maduro from power. And things have been getting steadily more repressive. And as a result, the opposition candidate who won, Edmundo Gonzalez, who won on the 28th of July, has had to go into exile in Spain. Opposition leaders are generally in hiding when they do appear on the streets. Some of them have been snatched and taken off to jail as well. And it's getting harder and harder for any independent voices here to say anything, really, not just Maduro, he didn't win the election, but really to present any independent view of what's going on. NGOs, media, both the formal laws in place to if you like, close down the civic space, and the way that the security forces are operating is getting tougher.
How did we get to this point? How did Venezuela get to this point? Because there has been an exodus of Venezuelans migrating to the U.S., crossing the Darien Gap, trying to get out because it's been so dangerous and quality of life has decreased so much. How, over the past so many years, what happened to led to this point?
Yeah, well, it's a long story, as you can imagine. I mean, this is a deterioration that's really been going on since even before Hugo Chavez, who was the founder of the current regime, before he came to power electorally in 1999 in a fair election, the same year I arrived, actually. But he came to power, really. He was a former army officer who staged a coup attempt in 1992. And he really came to power because the old two-party democracy had failed. It was, after many years of producing prosperity, Venezuela had become much, much poorer. People were very discontented. They wanted a change. They voted in this former army officer. And really, Chavez and the people around him and his successors set about, despite having come to power democratically, they set about gradually dismantling all the institutions of state, all the checks and balances that would normally ensure, that the opposition has a voice, that the press can operate freely, and so on. All these kind of things, not immediately, but over time, was slowly eroded. So, in a sense, the rot began really with the election of Chavez, or even before. But then what happened is that Chavez, as many people may remember, he died in 2013 of cancer at a fairly young age, and that was a big blow to what they call the revolution. He was the figure. He was a messianic leader, a charismatic guy who was really very dearly loved by the mass of the population, most people. And so Chavez dies. He's succeeded by Nicolas Maduro, who really has nothing remotely resembling his charisma or his ability, his political ability. And then not long after Maduro came to power, the oil price, on which the Venezuelan economy depends fundamentally for its stability and growth, the oil price, which had been for a decade really high, and so huge amounts of money had flowed through this country, the bottom fell out of the oil price. The oil market took a deep dive, and so all of a sudden you had, your charismatic leader was dead, and all the money was gone because they'd spent all the money. In fact, they'd spent more money than they had. The debt was enormous. So the economy starts to go really bad. And essentially, to sum it all up, Maduro, who's now heading into his third term, if he eventually does get inaugurated on the 10th of January, he has really had to rule much more by force than Chavez did. Because he doesn't have the money and he doesn't have the charisma. So that's, I suppose, in a nutshell, that's what happened.
Yeah. And I know Venezuela has had insanely high inflation, and there's been like nothing on the shelves, and it seems like a lot of the health infrastructure has been decimated. This is all what's being reported in Western media. As someone who's living there, is that your experience?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not just the formal institutions of state that have collapsed. The infrastructure has collapsed as well. And when I say infrastructure, I mean electricity, water, hospitals, roads, the internet, you name it. It's not working. Or it's only working partially. We have, very recently actually, we had a major nationwide blackout. The country was pretty much entirely without electricity for about 12 hours. A few years back, we had one that lasted 3 days. The water, where I live, for example, we have mains water just a couple of days a week. The roads are full of potholes. The hospital infrastructure has fallen apart, and many hospitals don't even have a guaranteed electricity supply or clean water supply. They don't have medicines. They don't have medical equipment, and so it's the people that have left the country have not just left because of poverty and the fact that they can't put food on the table anymore, but the country is not really livable. I mean, hardly anybody has medical insurance. And if you have a serious medical problem and you go to a public hospital, you may be worse off in the hospital than you are outside.
I think this is a great reminder for people who are ever concerned about why there are so many people that are migrating to the U.S., that this is the reason why. Okay. This is just my call out. People are looking for a better quality of life, and that is why it's important to be kind and welcome people who are trying to do the best for themselves with open arms.
You're right, and it's
My
important.
opinion.
It's important also to bear in mind that these people, they're not just getting on a plane and flying to Miami. You can't get on a plane and fly to Miami from that, but there are no direct air links with the United States. These are people who are, the vast majority of them are, walking, taking buses. They're crossing the Darien, which is probably the most hostile environment outside of the Arctic in the entire Western Hemisphere. And people are dying. People are getting robbed, raped, murdered on the way, having to pay thousands of dollars to crooks, to criminal gangs to get there. This is not a holiday. I mean, these people are not leaving on a whim because they feel like maybe it might be better to go somewhere else. These are people who are desperate, and so absolutely, it's really important to bear that in mind when it's entirely understandable that a country that is seeing a mass wave of immigration is concerned about it and concerned about the impact on their country, but it's nothing compared to what these people are fleeing.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. I mean, I think I don't know if you know the exact number that has migrated to the U.S., but it's...
To the US, I'm not sure. Overall, the figure, according to the United Nations, is nearly 8 million. That's about a quarter of the Venezuelan population that has left. The biggest number is in Colombia. There's about 2.5 million in Colombia. But we're certainly, in the US, certainly talking hundreds of thousands. I'm not sure if it's over 1 million.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It's a good reminder for people about why people are risking their lives to leave. I guess this kind of leads to my next question. The Tren de Aragua, one semester of 8th grade Spanish is not really pulling through at the moment. No matter what, when you have any type of migration, there are going to be people that are not representative of the total, but that unfortunately are just not there that are bad actors, right? And that's with any population. However, recently in the media, there's been an increase of seeing and talking about this gang. What do you know about it? What can you tell us about them? And then also whether or not the concerns of the media have any type of validity to it.
Yeah, the Tren de Aragua, Aragua is a state which is west of Caracas, and the tren means train. There are different versions of why they're called the Tren de Aragua, but anyway, essentially this is a criminal organization that grew up under Chavismo. This is not, in the past, Venezuela was not home to these very violent, large criminal gangs, but they did develop in recent years. And many of them were run out of prisons, believe it or not. The prisons, about half the prisons in Venezuela came to be run by their own inmates. And what that meant was that the people who rose to the top in the prison hierarchy were the people who were the most violent, had the most guns and the most resources. And they used the prisons as bases. And so the Tren de Aragua was run by a guy called El Niño Guerrero. Well, that was his nickname anyway. El Niño, the kid, Guerrero, and he ran for many years. Ran the Tren de Aragua from there until the government decided to move in one day, and mysteriously he and all his closest lieutenants somehow escaped. Anyway, they are very violent. They were into extortion and hijackings and drugs and all sorts of stuff, and very, very heavily armed. I mean, with automatic rifles, hand grenades, you name it. Generally, often much better armed than the police, in fact. Now, Venezuela, when the economy went bad in Venezuela, particularly from, say, about 2018 onwards, really that kind of crime became much less profitable in Venezuela. There was less to steal, if you like. And these gangs, wholly or in part, many of them moved out of the country and started preying on the Venezuelan diaspora and on the countries where the Venezuelan diaspora ended up, all up and down the Andes, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and in many cases becoming a real headache for local police forces in all those countries. Now, it's worth saying that sometimes criminals who present themselves as the Tren de Aragua are doing so because it instills fear. Doesn't necessarily mean that they belong to the Tren de Aragua. I mean, sometimes the name is used as a kind of calling card to say you better be careful because we're the Tren de Aragua, and you know what happens if you cross us. So not everybody that says they're Tren de Aragua really are. The government has had a curious attitude to them, which is that when obviously foreign governments started complaining about this and saying, will you stop exporting your criminals to us? The government here said this is an invention of the media and of our foreign opponents, and Tren de Aragua doesn't really exist. It's just a media phenomenon. But more recently, in fact, in the last few days, Maduro has been accusing the Tren de Aragua of plotting to overthrow him at the behest of foreign governments. So, they don't really have a very coherent account of what's going on. It's in terms of its operations in the US. I really don't know a lot about what's going there. I suspect that some of what's happening is this phenomenon that I mentioned, which is where other criminals use the name in order to carry out their own operations because it's a useful kind of label. But no doubt, that there are operations of the Tren de Aragua. In effect, what they've done is that they have followed the migrant trail, and in many cases, they benefited from it, and both because it makes it easier for them to hide among the population. If you have a Venezuelan accent in Chile, you would have stood out a few years ago, but you don't any longer, for example. Yeah. And migrants are subjected to extortion, and they're charged money to cross borders and stuff like this. That's pretty much the story of the Tren de Aragua. They are definitely to be feared.
Yeah. No, and I believe recently in the media there's this whole conservative ruckus regarding some apartment buildings in Aurora, Colorado, relating to some armed, I believe, Venezuelan migrants, but I'm going to fact check myself after this to make sure. Which one, right? It's like most things that happen, it's dependent on how people perceive, and that's different for everyone. But it does appear that the buildings were just not in great condition to begin with and not doing well. And it was just kind of one little section of it, right? Which is just a friendly reminder for people to do your own research and to not believe all the clickbaity headlines. But I've definitely seen this name more and more and more in the US media. And so it's good to understand where it comes from, the threat risk, and just kind of the basis and the history of it all. So thank you for sharing.
One of the things, just to check briefly there, that one of the things that I think is unfortunate in what's happened to Venezuela in recent years is that in many countries, Venezuela has become an internal political issue. So in other words, Venezuela is something that the Republicans use to bash the Democrats with. It's something that the Partido Popular in Spain uses to criticize the government of Pedro Sanchez. I mean, in many cases, this is the last thing Venezuela needs, because it means that the measures that are adopted with relation to Venezuela, whether it's recognizing or not recognizing a government, have to do more with internal politics than they have to do with what would actually be useful to resolve the situation in Venezuela.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess this I want to ask personally. You're an outspoken critic, and you mentioned that. Have you had any run-ins with the law? Have you feared for yourself at all?
I suppose the most, the point at which I felt most persecuted was quite a long time ago, back about 20 years ago. For a couple of years, I was president of the Foreign Press Association. And during that period, the then Minister of Information called a press conference one day, to which I wasn't invited, actually, despite being a journalist. As far as I remember, it was called specifically for the foreign press, but I wasn't invited. And at this press conference, the reason why he called the press conference was to denounce me and two other journalists as being leaders of the international media conspiracy to overthrow Hugo Chavez. And I had the misfortune to be the only one who was actually living in Venezuela at the time. So that made me feel a little uncomfortable, as you can imagine. It's not every day that you get a government minister, accusing you of something that actually, if you were ever convicted of it in Venezuela, could put you away for 25 to 30 years in jail. So that made me a little nervous. Fortunately, not long after that, he lost his job. And I don't think anybody in the rest of the government took him terribly seriously. But it is something that is constantly on your mind. It's my job to tell people what I think is happening here, like I'm doing right now. Yeah. And if I stop doing that, then there's not much point my being here. Or I can't do my job unless I'm obviously I can't do my job either if I self-censor, if I pretend that things are better than they are. It's not going to work either.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, thank you for telling the truth and being a voice for a lot of Venezuelans who do not have the privilege and the power that you have to be able to speak the way you do. So thank you. What do you think needs to happen next? And then also, where do you see Venezuela going in the future?
Yeah, well, that I suppose is my day job now, is trying to figure out what should be done. I mean, in Crisis Group, for those people who don't know it, what we try to do modestly is to contribute to the prevention and the resolution, mitigation of violent conflict. So, the way we do that is we write reports and we make recommendations and we speak out on the media and so on. And so right now, that for us is the key question. What should we be recommending? Where should this go from here? Because we were wholly on board with the electoral route, if you like, the fact that the opposition decided to participate in this election despite the fact that the conditions were extremely unfair, and despite the fact that the opposition in the past had often boycotted elections because they were so unfair. So we believed that this was the right thing to do, and I continue to believe that was the right thing to do. They won a stunning victory, and they can't, for now at least, there's no prospect of their presidential candidate taking office. So the question, one of the questions is, does this mean that's the end of the electoral route? There are more elections coming up next year. We have what the government's calling a mega election. We have state governors, mayors, and so on, city councillors, etc. But of course, the electoral authority here is in the hands of the government and has just shown that it's entirely willing to pull out of its hat a completely false result. So why would anyone want to take part in elections? It's a very difficult one. We don't have an answer to that right now. I think one of the things, the way we, when we're asked this question, for example, by governments and by multilaterals and by Venezuelan politicians or politicians from other countries, right now, the way we start to answer it is it's a bit like the way doctors approach a patient. First do no harm. Don't do anything that's going to make things worse. And one of the things that we think might make things worse is to go the route that the Trump administration went, and much of the rest of the world in 2019, by recognizing the government in inverted commas of Juan Guaido. It's different in the sense that Guaido although he was elected, he'd only ever been elected as head of parliament. He wasn't elected to the presidency. You had to stretch the constitution a bit to say that he was the legitimate president. Edmundo Gonzalez has clearly won an election and has every right to be inaugurated in January, but we just don't think that it's very useful to recognize as governments and pretend that they're governments, administrations that don't have any control over the day-to-day running of a country. It's not useful. So we don't think it would be a good idea for the world to go down that route again with Edmundo Gonzalez, even though it might seem like a fair thing to do in the sense that, most countries say, well, clearly he did win, so we should recognize him as president. The fact is, Nicolas Maduro is still in the presidential palace, will, until further notice, continue to run things in Venezuela. So it's not useful, it's not helpful. Countries need to deal with the government that's actually in power, and that includes negotiating with them, all sorts of things, much beyond the political situation. But I think pressure needs to be kept up. We're not terribly keen on the idea of piling on more sanctions, which will make Venezuelans poorer, will fuel, no doubt, more migration, and probably won't cause Maduro to consider making any concessions. So right now, it's really very difficult. Beyond insisting that the government has not proved that Maduro won, beyond maintaining the diplomatic pressure, maintaining the pressure in terms of human rights, because obviously here, human rights violations are daily and they're very severe. Just today in Geneva, the fact-finding mission, the UN's human rights mission for Venezuela was giving its latest report on what's going on and saying that really repression has reached unprecedented levels. So that pressure needs to be kept up. But so long as Maduro maintains the support of the armed forces and the police and all the institutions of government, it's very difficult to see how he can be persuaded to leave power, which he clearly doesn't want to do. And I think the opposition needs a new strategy. Their strategy of winning an election and somehow forcing Maduro to recognize the results seems to have run its course. I think the opposition now needs a strategy which can deal with this new situation in which things are going to be much harder on the ground. Organization, the whole civic space, I mean, the political space, media space, NGO space is all going to be much, much tighter. And so I think the opposition needs to have a really hard think about how to deal with this new situation.
Absolutely. You mentioned sanctions, and I do just want to touch on one more point. The U.S., I believe in 2023, under Biden, alleviated sanctions with under an agreement from Maduro that they would have a free and fair election. Obviously, that was not happening. And so I believe in April 2024, they reinstated the sanctions, the oil sanctions. In that period of time, when there were no sanctions, was there a better quality of life? Did that impact on the ground?
There was never a period in which there were no sanctions. I mean, there was partial sanctions relief, which was important. Primarily, I mean, the principal benefit that the government received was that it was able to sell oil into the US market, to sell oil at market prices. What had been happening under the sanctions regime is that Venezuelan oil was being sold at a heavy discount through all these kind of clandestine channels, mainly to Asia, a lot of it to China, to India. And that, of course, was a significant blow to the country's, to the income. I mean, as I said before, oil is the main thing that Venezuela relies on. The oil industry is in very bad shape, not due to sanctions primarily. It's primarily because it was ransacked. I mean, it was subject to extreme mismanagement and corruption, and Venezuela now produces less than a third of the oil that it produced when Maduro first came to power back in 2013. But during this period when there was sanctions relief, what that meant was that more oil could be sold. It was being sold principally by Chevron, the US corporation. And what that meant was that although the government wasn't directly receiving that money, the money was coming into the economy. And what that meant in turn was that it was possible to maintain the exchange rate, to keep inflation under control. And I'm not sure that you can say that things got much better during that period, but they certainly could have been worse, could have been a good deal worse if that hadn't happened. And now we're in the situation where the Chevron license in particular was never rescinded. When the sanctions were partially reinstated back at the end of April, when the Biden administration determined that Maduro was not going to run a free election, the Chevron license remained, and so that money has still been coming in. A lot of that money has still been coming in. And the question for the Biden administration and whoever takes office in the US in January 2025 is, do we allow this Chevron operation and others, smaller operations, to continue, or should we punish the government and thereby also punish Venezuelans by reinstating full sanctions? My personal view is that no, I don't think it would help, and I think what it would do is it would make life a lot worse for ordinary Venezuelans without persuading Maduro to make any significant concessions.
Thank you for providing insight. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to say, anything else you would like to comment on, or you think it's important for people to know?
Well, I suppose, we've talked about the international response in terms of primarily the US, also the EU, because it does go much wider than that. And within the region, this election has been treated with extreme skepticism, to say the least. Mm-hmm. Half a dozen countries in the region told Maduro the day after, this is clearly not credible. You've claimed to win, but you didn't. And so he expelled their diplomats. So half a dozen countries in the region now have no diplomatic relations with the Maduro government. Colombia and Brazil, who are the two most important neighbors, they're two of the biggest countries in Latin America, and they have the longest borders with Venezuela. They opted for a slightly more subtle approach. They said, show us the results, the detailed results, the breakdown by polling center, which we know you have, and you haven't shown us. And then we'll believe you. And in the meantime, let's sit down with the opposition and try to work this out. And they have been trying to get the two sides together. It has to be said with zero success so far, because I don't think that the government here is interested in any kind of talks until at least after January, when Maduro once again has the presidential sash placed on his shoulders. They want to get that over with before they even think about negotiating anything. So in the meantime, that's not going very far. What it has meant is that Venezuela's relations with the rest of the region have taken a severe downturn, and really Venezuela, the Maduro government, is heavily dependent now on its authoritarian allies, primarily elsewhere in the world, the Chinas, the Russias, Iran, Cuba, of course, just north of here, which has a big hand in what goes on. But we're certainly feeling a lot more isolated than we did before the election. Flights have been cut, embassies have been closed down, and so on. So right now, I think what we're really anxious to avoid is that Venezuela becomes another Nicaragua, where essentially there's no room for any kind of dissent. NGOs, press, opposition parties are all closed down. Even the International Red Cross, the church, get expelled from the country. That's something that we haven't got to yet, but we're not that far away from it.
Okay. Well, hopefully it doesn't get to that point. Hoping. Well, Phil, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. Thank you for using your voice to advocate for Venezuelans.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Please stay safe. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.